want to pause for a second here and talk about the idea of linguistic relativity. Your textbook jumps straight into the idea of, oh, linguistic relativity just means that language helps to shift or guide our perspective. But I want to go back to what we mean by linguistic relativity and refresh our memory about these complicated linguistic terms that we've learned. So linguistic relativity rests on a principle that we know that signifiers are arbitrary. So there's no reason why I call that a table and a Spanish speaker calls that a mesa. There's nothing in that object which makes it more likely to be called one word or another word. So the signifiers are not connected to anything in the physical world. There's nothing about the word dog just because of its furriness or its bark. It's just the word we happen to use for it. But if that is true, then in some ways, what we choose to signify, the way we divide up the world, the signifieds, are also somewhat arbitrary. Where we're going to draw those lines between one thing and the next might be quite different. That's a good example from our video of signifieds being divided up in different ways than we would perceive them. How do people chop up the world differently? That is certainly something that society has signified. It's a totally different signified than our system of signification. Obviously we can know what north, south, east, and west is, but we usually don't in our daily lives know that. But for them, that signified is super important, and they're orienting themselves in directionality all day long. So it's a different way of thinking about the world. It is a great example of how, in fact, our language can guide our thoughts and our actions so that we start thinking in terms of the cardinal directions or directionality in general. I love the example of how time is oriented in that society. It's not something that is just in front of us or behind us. It's actually on a landscape. It's mapped onto a landscape. And so the signifiers, those things, those words that are arbitrary, change our perception of what is being signified. There's another example from some cutting reality up into different things. Yes. Okay, so the organization of events, how you might put time into different buckets, or the progression of time in general might be quite differently perceived in different places. Yes, I thought my best example of this, I thought, was the colors, the blues. We say blue and we say light blue and dark blue, and we perceive that as one spectrum of color, whereas in Russian, famously, they would divide that up into two places and see that as two different things, not as just shades of blue. Another example I want to talk about that shows up in the film, but shows up in your book a little differently. So in the film, they talk about the idea of an accident and the agency. And in some languages, if it is an accident, then you don't specify the person who did it because it's an accident. You wouldn't specify who did it because it's obviously an accident. And for people who speak those languages, you won't need to specify who did it. Whereas in English, we tend to get very concerned about accidents. Or, as my grandfather used to chide me, there are no accidents. You did something. Who did this? So there is this difference, how we divide up the world in accidents and events. But evidentiality is somewhat related to that, and it basically refers to the idea of how do you know that? When I make a statement, the vase broke, how do I know that happened? And there are some languages that in their grammatical structures, you can't make a statement without specifying how you knew that happened. So I can't just say the vase broke. I have to either say, I saw the vase broke, I saw the vase break, I came into the room later and the vase was broken, or somebody told me the vase was broken. So you can't make it just a statement without telling you what's going on. Your book uses this example, which I think their translation of these phrases are a little bit intense for these, but in the grammar of this language, if you're specifying whether Harry is chopping wood or not, you're saying, I see him doing it, or I heard him. So you have either direct evidence or you have indirect evidence, or then even further indirect evidence, which is that, hey, he's gone from his house and he has an axe with him, so he's probably chopping wood, or he generally does that, or I just heard somebody tell me that he's chopping wood. So all in these languages, you don't just get to say things without specifying how you know that. What about English? Oh, I've just told you, in English, anything goes. We don't have to tell you. You can tell all kinds of things without telling anybody how you know them. And they speculate that this might be a reason why it's so easy to pass along fake information or misinformation, because, hey, you don't have to, you don't have to specify how you know what you know. It's just there. So this is, and again, an interesting example of whether your language requires you or not to say how you know something. So another example in the textbook, which also comes up in the film, is the numbers. The numbers. So in English, we have obviously singular and plural, and they give you the example of Yucatec Maya, in which case it can be one dog or more than one. Although now that I'm thinking about it, there's a bunch of word in English. If I say I saw a bunch of deer, or no, if I saw deer on my way to school, could be one deer, could be a bunch of deer. But the idea here, or well, let's use her example. The idea is that in some languages, you don't bother to count as much. You have one, two, and then lots. One, two, or many. This is actually my least favorite example, and tell you, I think it's baloney, but let me just first start out with, why do we pay so much attention to numbers? What are we always counting for? Why are we always concerned about numbers? What are we up to? What are you counting all day long? Money. Yeah, we do a lot of counting with money. We want to know exactly how many penguins I have because we want to sell those penguins, and we want to know how much I can make for those penguins. We're very concerned with how much money I have, how much money you have, etc. And so I'm going to guess, I don't know, but I'm going to guess that in a society that doesn't care as much about counting, there's probably less counting because they don't need to count so much. There's probably less inequality. You either have one, you have two, or you have a lot. We're just going to chill out here. Now, Boroditsky makes, again, what I consider to be a weird claim. She says, well, the people who are in these societies aren't going to have access to algebra, and so they can't make a building like this. Now, did we need algebra to make this building? Maybe somebody did. But I would say that most of the great buildings in the world were made by societies that did not have algebra. In 100 years or so, this building is going to crumble into dust, but people will probably still be going to Rome to see the Colosseum and all those wonderful Roman architecture. And if there's one thing we know about the Romans is they did not have algebra. Has anybody ever tried to do multiplication with Roman numerals? Long division with Roman numerals? You can't even know what a Roman numeral is. It's so hard. And if you try to do multiplication or division, you're going to be totally in trouble. In fact, we would have never developed algebra had we not gotten numerals from somebody else. Where'd our numbers come from? Anybody remember what our numerals are called? Yes, Arabic numerals. Whoa, hey, what are they doing down there? Yeah, exactly. They're the ones that came up and gave us literacy and scientific knowledge because they were preserving that. And eventually that allowed people to develop algebra because of Arabic numerals. Which brings me to another point, is that in languages, these words for counting are very easily adopted and passed from different societies to another. So let us say that there is a language that you don't have numbers in. It's very easy to bring in some number words from Arabic or English or another language and just bring them into your world. The other thing I want to say here is that we tend to think of ourselves because of our own experience. And by us, I mean US Americans born and raised in America. We believe that you have one language and that you're a monolingual person, because most of us are very monolingual, fiercely monolingual. We're one of the most monolingual societies in the world. But in the world, in history, across the world, most people grow up with more than one language. Most people in human history have grown up multilingual. And so if you don't have counting terms in one language, there's probably a language adjacent to you that does, and you have that as well. Which brings me to the point is that language influences our thought, but it doesn't control it. There's still possibilities for perception. And so, sure, maybe Russian speakers do a better job dividing up the spectrum of blue if asked. That doesn't mean that we can't start to perceive those things. It doesn't mean that we can't change our language or our thoughts, and it doesn't restrict our thinking. And so we have to be careful sometimes with some of these things. You have to be careful that you don't impose these things on other people to the extent that it's not going to limit their thought patterns. It might channel them in different ways. It might guide our thoughts, but it's not going to be restrictive. Don't worry about those people who are dealing with the penguins. They'll be fine. They'll go to school and learn counting languages all over the world. So anyway, in any case, this is a great example of linguistic relativity and how language is a guide to our thoughts and things like that, but is not controlling or restricting.